This podcast is brought to you by Optimum Design Associates. Check us out at www.optimumdesign.com. You're listening to Outsourcing Things You Should Know. Information, opinion, and some occasional attitude about electronics outsourcing.
Hello and welcome to the next installment of Outsourcing Things You Should Know. I'm Everett Frank.
And I'm Sherrie Hubbard.
And we have Rob in the control room doing all the right things.
Thank you, Rob, for your support. So, I'm thinking today, let's talk about the EBN article.
The EBN article.
Yes, shedding light on electronic component pricing.
Yes.
That's a very interesting subject because, you know, people just don't know. They don't know about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly why we're doing this morning.
We're shedding light.
Yeah, I think this would be a great thing to talk about.
All right, let's do it.
So, OEMs are usually kept in the dark. Did you know that?
Yeah.
About where component prices come from, who really controls them, and how to discover the best deals. How do we do that?
Yeah. It's super interesting. You know, I think it starts with there's a sort of broad misconception that pricing is directly related to volume.
Correct.
And that's a misconception.
Absolutely.
We have our good friends at Lytica.com, that have done studies on this. They've actually collected quite a database. This is data that they've collected directly from customers, so not from the sell side, but from the buyer side. They've collected quite a database, and then they've analyzed their data. And when they associate the best prices, it comes from, number one is the commodity spend, and second, the geographic location.
And isn't that interesting?
It's interesting. So so if you think about it, it makes sense. So let's say that I buy $1 million a year worth of capacitors, and in this particular buy, I want to buy 100.
Right.
So would I pay the highest 100-piece price, or would I get a price based on my larger relationship? Mm-hmm. Right. So that's really what commodity spend is. When you think about it, it really makes sense. But that's the biggest lever you've got.
So, you know, there's two things that really don't matter so much. And you might be surprised to know that it's distributors and contract manufacturers.
Yeah, that's right. And that's quite a statement that people really think that I need to go to the big contract manufacturer to get the best price,
right?
Because they have all the spend, and in ways there's some truth to that. But we're going to talk about exactly where those prices come from, so we get a better understanding of where OEMs can go to best drive their prices.
That's correct.
So it starts with kind of understanding the basics of distribution. There's two types of distributors. There's broadly they're called authorized and unauthorized.
Right.
So an authorized distributor is your franchise distributor. An unauthorized distributor we call brokers, or more euphemistically, independent distributors.
That's correct.
More politely, and they have a great place in the world. So I don't mean that anything. Independent distribution has a very important part of the industry.
That's right. We couldn't do it without them.
Authorized distribution is really distinguished by two special agreements that they have with OEMs. The first is called the ship from stock and debit program, which we're going to talk about more extensively.
Isn't that also called just debit?
It's called the debit system also. Yeah. And the other privilege is stock rotation. Stock rotation means that a distribution buys a big bulk of inventory every year, every quarter. Generally, they place these big buys with their OEMs. And some of it doesn't move. They're trying to buy inventory they think their customers will want. Sometimes it doesn't move, so they have the ability then to return it back for credit after a period of time, and that's referred to as rotating stock, or
that's
trying
correct.
to keep the fresher, most available stock.
Yep.
So unauthorized distributors don't have access to that privilege, but authorized distributors do, and it's an important distinction with them. Along with other things, they get guarantees, warranty support, things like that. But the big deal is the ship from stock and debit program. So to distinguish that, the first type of pricing
would be book price.
With book price.
Yeah. And there's three types, right? Book, direct, and broken. And it all starts with book price.
It all starts with book price.
Yeah, it does. Yep. the price you see at distributors is what you call book price. Arrow, Avnet, DigiKey, those kind of places. And it's always seems to be separated in volumes.
Yeah, they present it online in volumes. What they're really doing online is they're following what we used to call the price books, which was literally price books, physical books that were sent around to distributors. And you would have to go through.
You've been around for a long time.
I've been around too long. I predate the book. So that's why we call it the book cost. They used to send out literally physical books, and that would contain the suggested resale price.
Published by the manufacturer.
Published by the manufacturer. Mm-hmm. And you really see that reflected online now. If you go into DigiKey or Arrow or Avnet, you see those price breaks out in quantity.
Right.
And really, all that reflects is a different markup off the same cost.
Correct.
So their cost is always the same, and it's that standard book cost.
Yes.
Yeah. What's interesting about it, too, is that when a distributor buys their inventory, they always pay the book cost. So no matter what they may end up selling it in the future, they're holding it in their inventory financially at the book cost in almost all cases.
Very interesting stuff.
Interesting stuff.
So
what happens then next is the ship from stock and debit program. So in a debit program, the idea is that the manufacturer wants to control their end resales.
Absolutely.
And so how do they do that?
Yeah.
Right? They've sold everything to the distributor at this book cost, and now how do they change the prices in the future? So the way they do it is the ship from stock and debit program. So if you want to get a special price through a distributor, the distributor calls up the manufacturer and they say, hey, XYZ OEM wants to buy a zillion of these widgets. Do you think that you'd like to lower the price for them? Mm-hmm. And the semiconductor company may say, yes, that's a great idea. We would love to do that. And so they extend a debit. So a debit is going to is an accounting entry that will reduce the book cost when the distributor ships it. So let's say a distributor buys a bunch of components for $1. They hold them at $1 cost. Mm-hmm. Their online price may show $1.50 and up, as an example, right?
Right.
But they're going to hold it at $1 cost. And so they come in for an OEM and say, hey, we'd like to see if we could get a special price. The semiconductor company agrees and issues a debit for, let's say, 50 cents. And that's going to now reduce the price of the thing to 50 cents, of the widget to 50 cents. The distributor will now mark it up from 50 cents, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens on the distributor side is when they ship that, they will then take that shipment and do an accounting entry, a debit back to the manufacturer to sort of get their 50 cents back.
Specific to the customer.
Specific to that customer, right. So almost all of the really large dollar volumes, let's say, in typical builds of semiconductors, things like that, is controlled by ship from stock and debit. The things that are the exception might be caps, resistors, some things like that.
Your penny parts.
The penny parts are sometimes bought in bulk.
That would make sense.
And that makes a little bit more sense. There's a little less strategic control, right? Certainly any of the high-value semiconductors are subject to ship from stock and debit.
And this system is certainly core to how authorized distribution works.
Yeah, it's really at the key of it. And it's driven really by the semiconductor companies. The semiconductor companies want to control their market. They want to maximize their value, right?
Absolutely.
That's what they do. That's what they're good at. And so this system is really in place to provide a method for the semiconductor companies to both take advantage of distribution and be able to control the value that they get for their parts, control their resales. An interesting thing, too, that's a variant of the ship from stock and debit system is the registrations. So
I was going to mention that.
Yeah.
Registrations, a very interesting subject.
Yeah. So registrations to many OEMs is an evil term. So what happens in registrations is first of all, registration is an effort on the part of semiconductor companies to incentivize distributors to do the upfront design-in engineering. And so the idea is that if the distributor goes and puts all the support and energy into advocating an OEM, advocating a semiconductor company, and get their part designed into a socket, that they should be rewarded for that effort. And that's the idea that's going on. And the mechanism the semiconductor companies use is a registration. So registration basically means that they're the only ones that are going to get the debit. And that's put broadly. Sometimes it means they're going to get a better debit than the next guy. But in essence, a registration means that only the distributor with the registration is going to have access to the debited price. Everyone else is going to work off something closer to book, or probably book price.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely, book price.
So from an OEM's point of view, from a procurement department's point of view, that's limiting their choice, right? And
absolutely.
They do not tend to like that.
I can imagine.
And sometimes they don't like it one little bit. But that's why it happens. Now, the semiconductor companies realize that the OEMs don't always appreciate it, and at the end of the day, the semiconductor companies really want OEMs to be able to procure through the channels that they would like to procure through.
Well, sure.
And they're not really trying to restrict it, but sometimes it has that effect. So in certain circumstances, the semiconductor companies will step in and break the registration. It's more and more difficult these days. Usually they do a better job up front. So let's say Arrow is a really preferred distributor at a given OEM.
Right.
And Avnet comes in and wants to get a registration. In general, the semiconductor companies are pretty good these days about saying, you know what, Arrow's the preferred guy here. Don't try to snake into the account by getting it. So there's these things that happen.
Poor Avnet.
Yeah, in this case, yeah.
So does that bring us to direct price?
Yeah, so a direct price is pretty simple. That's the price that the semiconductor companies will sell to the OEM directly.
Right.
In cases where there's such a relationship.
Right.
Or to the contract manufacturer directly. So that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. So we've learned that ultimately the component manufacturers tend to base their price decisions on the prevailing market.
Yeah.
Looking at supply and demand.
They're going to look at supply and demand. They will look at strategic value of a customer. So let's say that they're really trying to get into a certain market, or they want to, for instance, they'd love to tout that they're in the iPhone, as an example, right? So they may want to say we're really in some marquee product or in some marquee technology. So there can be strategic reasons a semiconductor company will lower a price. But the key here is that they're trying to control what the pricing is going to be.
Right.
There was a recent lawsuit that actually shed light into this. There was a suit. Xilinx sued Flex over this.
Yes.
And Rob, are we going to put a link to this?
That we are. Any of these relevant articles will be linked in the descriptions to the video.
Excellent. So we'll put a link to this. To that suit on there, but the suit, I don't know whatever happened to the lawsuit, but in the claims on the lawsuit, Xilinx details the system, and they detail the ship from stock and debit system, and they discuss it. So you can see an additional reference to what we're talking about here. Again, it's one of those things. This is in no one's interest to really describe. So the semiconductor companies and distributors never sit down with OEM customers and describe the system. It's just one of those things that doesn't happen. But that lawsuit sheds light into this as well and explains exactly what's happening out there. So it brings us kind of around to kind of the question we posed in the beginning: do contract manufacturers matter that much in terms of pricing? And really the answer is they don't. The biggest issue is the OEM.
Yep.
What pricing does the semiconductor companies want to extend to that OEM is the fundamental question. That price is available, let me put this sort of delicately, to any savvy contract manufacturer. So this kind of comes back around to the question of, should a big contract manufacturer, do they have an advantage over smaller contract manufacturers?
Absolutely none.
And they really don't. But it requires savvy, and here's why. These semiconductor companies, distributors, they're all trying to maximize their resales. It's what they do. A large contract manufacturer has access to a more comprehensive database of past history.
That makes sense.
Right. So it is easier for a large contract manufacturer to see the prevailing price of a given part. Right. So it's easier for a big contract manufacturer to see and discover the prevailing market. It is just as possible for smaller contract manufacturers to discover the prevailing price, but they may have to work harder, and they're definitely going to have to be smarter than the average large contract manufacturing procurement or quoting people. You're going to the small contract manufacturer needs to really understand the system, and to understand how to work with distribution and at times the direct suppliers to make sure that they're getting the actual cost. And it may take the OEM's involvement as well sometimes. There are situations where there will be preferences granted. So for instance, games get played in the system.
No. Games?
Crazy as that may seem. So the semiconductor companies, as an example, just not to name anyone, but they'll want to say, we'll provide the same price under the same terms to anybody. We're open to whoever you want to use.
Absolutely.
Right? So one thing that can so easily happen is a customer will call and say, hey, we'd like a quote based on 500 of these things.
Right.
And the customer may be giving you a monthly or a quarterly volume, right? So 500 a quarter is going to equal 2,000 a year, right? So one contract manufacturer might call up the manufacturer and say, I'd like a 500-piece price. Another contract manufacturer, realizing that semiconductor companies tend to price based on annual volumes, will say, I would like the 2,000-piece annual price, right? Same opportunity, but two slightly different questions are being asked to the semiconductor company.
Right.
And so they will respond differently, right? And so sometimes they'll get very gamey about this if the semiconductor company has a preference, and they'll say, well, you didn't call in on Tuesday, so the other guy called in on Wednesdays, and we do better pricing on Wednesdays. They do gamey things. So sometimes the best practice is really, and this is where you see top companies going now, OEMs are best served by directly negotiating their pricing. And certainly their most influential prices, and that way they remain in control. This is much more achievable than many OEMs believe. Many OEMs, I would venture to say most OEMs, certainly mid and small OEMs, think they need to go to Flextronics and Jabil to get their best possible prices, and then nobody else can touch them. This isn't true at all.
Absolutely.
An OEM can go.
Learned.
They go directly through either their distribution or direct and discover what their prices are and ensure that those same prices are available to whatever contract manufacturer that they choose. There's no necessary advantage for one contract manufacturer over another. But the contract manufacturer and often the OEM need to be savvy to the system so that they can drive the costs to be the same. And now the advantage here then is the OEM can now base their sourcing decision based on things like geography or service levels, quality levels, etc., rather than being a sort of slave to the belief that their price is going to come from only one particular contract manufacturer.
Very well put.
Yeah, so it's an important concept.
Yes, it is.
That's what we know today
That is what we know today.
about electronic component pricing. We hope that this has been helpful to you. And we look forward to our next podcast. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Sherrie.
Thank you, Everett. Rob, thank you for your support, as always.
Yeah, thank you guys. Well done. So there you have it. That's our show. This podcast is brought to you by Optimum Design Associates. We're online at www.optimumdesign.com. You can also stay up to date with the latest episodes on Twitter at OptimumEMS. Our show is produced by Rob Frank with additional support from the Optimum Design Associate staff.